Hi guys, I hope you're doing great. And in this video, we're going to be discussing about a very important topic, that is those policies that reduce the current account deficit. Now, current account deficit is a topic that is mostly tested in exams, and especially the policies that the government uses in order to reduce the deficit. So guys, this is an important video. I would definitely want you to watch it till the end, okay? If you want to grasp the concept clearly. So there are two policies that the government uses in order to reduce the current account deficit. And the first policy is the expenditure reducing policies, right? I'll try my best to make my handwriting as legible as possible. So, the expenditure reducing policy and the another policy is expenditure switching policy. These are two policies that the government uses: expenditure switching and expenditure reducing. And we're going to see that what comes under the expenditure switching and expenditure reducing policies. Now, guys, expenditure switching policies basically. Now, guys, expenditure reducing policy basically, involves the policies that will actually reduce, right? It is going to reduce the overall spending. So the overall spending that is basically done on your imports, right? That is it's also called the expenditure dampening policies. So expenditure reducing policies are also known as expenditure dampening policies because they dampen and reduce the expenditure. So the aim of the policy is to overall cut down the spending, that is the expenditure that is done by the domestic firms and the consumers on the import. So it's basically done to reduce the import expenditures, right? So the import expenditures are supposed to be reduced through these policies, right? And the expenditure switching policy involves those policies, that reduce your sorry an expenditure switching policies basically involves those policies that involves uh, changing changing the goods that people buy. And when you say that it involves changing the goods that people buy, you're actually trying to say that we're trying to shift the expenditure from the imported products. We're trying to shift the expenditure from imported products to the domestic products, right? We want the domestic consumers and firms to not rely on imported goods and instead consume more of domestic goods so that the domestic industry actually improves and the GDP rises, and there's more living standards and more tax revenues for the government as well, right? So let's start with the first policy, that is the expenditure reducing policies, right? Expenditure reducing policies, and guys, we're doing expenditure reducing policies to actually cut down the current account deficit. Oh, by the way, I didn't define what a current account deficit is. So current account deficit is a shortfall where your outflows are exceeding your inflows, in terms of, you can say that your import expenditures are exceeding your export revenues. Or you can also say that your the total of your balance of trade, investment income and current transfers, the outflows from the balance of trade, the current transfers and the investment income exceeds the inflows from balance of trade, current transfers and your investment income, right? So that results into a current account deficit, and current account is one of the major components of balance of payment, right? That has the potential to drive the overall BOP into a deficit or a surplus. Now, guys, expenditure reducing policies further involves policies that we use, such as, now, guys, as I said, that expenditure reducing policies, they try to reduce the overall spending on imports. So the aim of the policy is basically to cut down the level of aggregate demand. So we need to reduce the aggregate demand. That is the ultimate aim of the policies, because when aggregate demand will reduce, people will spend less, and when they'll spend less, they'll also spend less on imports as well, because the more the incomes, the more the consumption expenditure on domestic goods, the more the national income, the more the the marginal propensity to import, and the more the marginal propensity to import, the more the imports are sucked into the economy. So that is what we actually want to reduce, right? So what will the government do is that the government would implement contractionary fiscal policy, and similarly the government would implement contractionary monetary policy. And what is contractionary fiscal and monetary policy? Contractionary fiscal and monetary policy both are demand side policies, whereby if the government implements contractionary fiscal policy, it is going to reduce the amount of government spending it does on the economy. That is, reduce the amount that is spent on education, healthcare, infrastructure, reduce the amount of public sector wages, reduce the public spending overall, and that would definitely have a damping effect on aggregate demand. And the other way that the government could reduce the amount of AD through contractionary fiscal is to increase the amount of taxation in the economy, right? Increase the amount of taxation involves increasing your income taxes, increasing your corporate taxes, increasing your indirect taxes like VAT and general sales tax as well. Okay. Moving forward, the other thing that the government can actually do is that it could increase the rate of interest in the economy, increase interest rates, or it could reduce your money supply in the economy, right? And that will again have a dampening impact on the aggregate demand. And the overall effect would be that all of these policies, all of these policies would reduce your aggregate demand. And if your aggregate demand in the economy would fall, it is going to reduce the overall incomes in the economy. Your overall national income will fall, overall incomes will fall, and as a result of that, the incomes will fall. It is going to reduce your marginal propensity to propensity to import. Now, guys, a marginal propensity to import is just a term that is also used in A2 as well. So it's just my personal preference that I like to use it over here in AS as well, and there's no harm in it because examiner won't penalize you. There's no restriction on this, right? So you can use this term as well. It's just my personal preference. If someone doesn't want to use it, he or she has his own opinion, right? So reduce marginal propensity to import, and as a result of that, that is going to result into less sucking in of imports. That's an economic term that you will use, and as a result of that, the demand for imports will fall. When demand for imports will fall, it is going to reduce the expenditure on your imports, and it is going to improve the current account deficit. It is going to improve your trade balance, or you can say it is going to rectify your current account deficit, and that is what the policy was intended to do, right? So this is how the policy. So all of this is saying that expenditure reducing policy is kind of effective, and how it ended up reducing your current account deficits, right? So guys, but okay, and again you can make the diagram here as well, and the diagram would be the same, where you can draw your long run aggregate supply, and then you're like, if this is your aggregate demand in the economy, 81, and then it falls to 82, and as a result of that, your national income falls from Y1 to Y2, and because diagrams are very important. You have to explain through diagrams in exam, guys. You must make sure that you draw appropriate diagrams. It's not only the diagrams that you have to draw, so it's not like you'll just draw a diagram and then you'll leave it like that for the examiner to automatically assess it. You have to explain it, what the diagram is telling you. So you can go like, the above diagram shows that, or the below diagram shows that. Okay. On the x-axis you measure your real GDP, and on the y-axis you measure your price level. Okay. Moving forward, this is the first policy, but again, let's study the evaluation of this policy. The evaluation, guys, of this policy would be that you know these expenditure reducing policies, that is contractionary fiscal and contractionary monetary policy, although will be successful in rectifying the deficit, but it would conflict, guys. It would conflict with other macroeconomic objectives. So it is going to directly conflict with other macroeconomic objectives. For example, let's say if the trade balance improves, let's say the trade balance improves, or the balance of, or the trade deficit reduces, and that we know, fine, the trade balance is improving or trade deficit is reducing, but again that would result into it's going to result into, we understand that it's going to result into your import expenditures to fall, but at the same time, and that will help you in improving your or rectifying your deficit, because the import expenditures in the economy is increasing. But one thing is that you have reduced the level of aggregate demand in the economy, and you achieve this through a reduction in AD. Now, reduction in AD is not itself considered a good thing, especially if you have already you have a lot of slack in the economy. So if you haven't reached full employment, your economy is not overheated, and then you are reducing your AD, so it might have a recessionary impact on the economy. It would result into a recessionary, a recessionary impact. So obviously will come despite whether your economy is overheated or not. But there's a difference between the word recessionary impact and a recession, because recession is indicating a situation of a persistent decline in AD for a consecutive period of two successive quarters. However, a recessionary impact is showing this position where AD is falling. So if AD is just falling, don't end up saying it will culminate into a recession, because recession is an entirely different thing that's for 6 months your AD falls, right? But a mere decline in AD is just a recessionary impact, not a recession. So although we know, so again, what will happen if your national income will fall? Again, it will result into cyclical unemployment, or that's also known as demand deficit unemployment, and that would obviously culminate into falling GDPs, falling tax revenues. So it's kind of making the economy more worse off than making the better off. So again, there's a big conflict. The economy, the government needs to actually ensure that whether, or decide whether implementing expenditure reducing policies is an effective measure or not. Especially if you're a developing country, you're a poor country, you can't afford cyclical unemployment, you can't afford falling GDPs because already you have a lot of national debt. You need to repay your debts, and if GDP is falling, it would result into a rise in debt to GDP ratio, right? And again, falling GDP reduces the potential for economic growth. It reduces actual growth because again, falling GDP is a sign that it's reducing actual growth, and then it creates a lot of spare capacity in the economy, and then it's not a good sign to if you want to attract foreign direct investment in the economy, because it also result into a fall in foreign direct investment as well. So you could say that you could say as an evaluation, because remember that the last part of evaluation I always say to my students is that it ends up in a judgment para or a conclusion para, right? And you could say that the side effects, you could say that these side effects could be worse, could be, you're not going to say are worse, you could say could be, because you're going to speak in normative language, not in positive objective language. These side effects could be worse than the benefits of an improved trade position, right? And hence you could say, and hence are rarely used, and hence they are rarely used to reduce current account. So if a question is asking that discuss whether the government should use them or not, so you could write this line that the benefit could the side effect could outweigh the benefit, hence are rarely used to reduce current account deficits, because reducing the level of AD in the economy is not a good thing. It has a major worsening impact on various other macroeconomic objectives. So this line could help you evaluate these policies, right? And come up with a reasoned conclusion. Okay. Now the second policy of the government is apart. So we are done with expenditures. We're done with expenditure reducing policy. Now we're going to be switching to expenditure switching policy. As I said before as well, that expenditure switching policy involves reducing your expenditure on, in fact, shifting your expenditure from imported goods to domestic goods, so that domestic industry expands, so that exports expands. So definitely here we are actually, instead of reducing the level of AD in the economy, here we are actually promoting our domestic industries, so that the expenditure switches from imports to automatically domestic industries. And there are various ways of doing that. One way of expenditure switching policy is protectionism, right? The government can use trade barriers, trade protectionism, such as quotas, embargoes, tariffs, uh, domestic trade subsidies, all of that, right? So these protectionism policies will help reduce the quantity and the import expenditure as well. It would reduce the size of the imports. It would reduce the overall import expenditure, and hence, if import expenditure reduces, and if the quantity of your imports are falling, so obviously, if your quantity of imports are falling, definitely the remaining demand for the consumer would, or the firm would be satisfied through buying up from domestic producers, right? If you're reducing the size of the imports, so the consumer would satisfy his demand through buying from domestic producers, right? And again, so domestic industry would flourish in that way, right? And that is what you want to do, and that is how the government actually reduces the current account deficit, by reducing the amount of import expenditures through imposition of tariffs and all of that. But again, like I said, that whenever you will be attempting a question, you cannot attempt it without the evaluation, because evaluation is a very, very important thing that you have to know. And guys, I always say that evaluation, if a lot of students think that evaluation just means to give advantages and disadvantages, because evaluation is not advantages and disadvantages. is. Evaluation means that are you're giving an argument. You're arguing on something in different ways, and you say something that this is going to happen, but at the same time you have an argument against what you are saying, and you are giving another side of it, right? And that culminates into a reasoned conclusion or a judgment, right? So evaluation, basically, if I want to sum up what evaluation just means, guys, that you are bringing the examiner, or you are telling the examiner a certain viewpoint, right? You're telling him that you are trying to bring his attention to a certain viewpoint. That is what evaluation is all about, right? So yeah, so that is what protectionism is, and then let's study the evaluations. What is going to happen if the government imposes or if the government pursues an expenditure switching policy to reduce your current account deficits. So first of all, you could write about the fact that there would be strong retaliation from the trading partners, and countries will. The point is that at times these protectionism measures are not actually welcomed or considered by or considered well by our trading partners, right? So in that case, countries kind of look down, or they kind of frown upon us, because for them, their export industry is actually made to suffer because of a trade deficit in our country. So if Pakistan is imposing tariffs on, let's say China, then China's exporters are suffering. So again, China would not be happy by that, right? And we can't expect China to react kindly to us, right? So that is one evaluation that you would give. So again, retaliation. The problem with retaliation is that um, if the retaliation is done back on us, and if they retaliate much stronger than how we retaliated, then our exports would fall, because if they retaliate on our exports because we retaliated on their exports, or we impose a barrier on their exports, so what is going to happen? Although our import expenditures would fall because we imposed tariffs and quotas, but at the same time, since they retaliated back on us, and their retaliation was much bigger than our retaliation, so overall our export revenues would fall. So instead of being better off, we are now worse off, right? And their retaliation offsetted all the benefits of protectionism for us, right? So again, this could represent government failure as well, right? So it culminated into a tit for tat situation. So again, so what I'm trying to say is that what is going to happen is that if they impose the protectionism back on us, and that is much stronger, so it could reduce our country's export revenues more than they reduce the import expenditure. So our country's export revenues would fall by a significantly larger amount than the reduction in import expenditures. And again, what will this happen if our export revenues fall by a significantly larger amount than the reduction in import expenditures? So our net export revenues would fall, and when this happens, our AD would decline. Instead of improving the real GDP, our national income or our real GDP would actually fall, and it would also create unemployment, and the whole policy would be a failure. That's a situation of government failure, and it would result into the worsening of the deficit. Instead of being in our favor, it actually resulted into the worsening of a deficit, right? So this is how you need to evaluate. Guys, one more thing that you are noticing here is that each and every time when I'm saying, I'm not directly jumping to points. Chain of analysis is very important. Chain of analysis basically means that you say something and then you explain it, and you ultimately culminate it into the fact that, so I didn't directly say that retaliation would result into the worsening of trade deficit. I explained the examiner how will that happen, how will that entire process happen, right? Okay, so this is the first evaluation that you can give for protectionism of imposing trade barriers, right? Now, if a question has asked, if you are giving policies, if you're answering a question on policies, it entirely depends on you whether you want to make a tariff diagram or not, because the question is directly not asking you on protectionism or international trade. If the question was directly asking you on protectionism or international trade, then you have to had to make the tariff diagram. But now, it's up to you. If you want to make it, you make it. If you don't want to make it, you don't make it. But again, a tariff diagram would, because there's a lot of other evaluation points that you can give, and a tariff diagram would then, it would be too much of unnecessary analysis specifically for this type of a question. So I wouldn't recommend to make a tariff diagram for expenditure switching policies, because there are many other policies that you need to be fitting in the same answer, right? So be very careful about when and where to make the diagram. Otherwise, if a question is separately asking you on protectionism or trade barriers, then you have to make a diagram. So the part two, or the second evaluation would be that, again a very good point, that especially protectionism such as tariffs, what the result is that tariff increases the price for consumers, and if it increases the price for consumers, we have already seen in the tariff diagram that it results into a deadweight loss of consumer surplus, and we've already seen that diagram as well when we were studying international trade. So and all of those people who have not studied from me and are watching this video, they must be knowing that how tariff results into a deadweight loss of consumer surplus, right? So we're not going into those details right now, but tariff results into a deadweight loss of consumer surplus, and that is because the simple reason is that if the prices are rising, consumers are actually forced to reduce their consumption, and a rise in price results into a loss of consumer welfare, right? And you need to understand that if tariffs are imposed on imported goods, and especially key imports, those imports that those key imports like maybe clothing, food, vehicles. These are goods that are used in everyday consumption for the consumer, and and also manufactured goods like capital goods for the firms as well. So if these are key imports, so definitely what will happen is that it will result into because these are the goods that, especially this area, these are the goods that poor people are actually relying upon. So the poor is relying upon these goods, and so the poor is made to suffer. So you can evaluate that it makes one segment of society worse, or especially the poor, and it hits hard on them, right? And because now they'll have to spend a greater proportion of their income, because you need to understand that demand for these goods is inelastic, especially for clothing and food, right? So it would result into poor people being made worse off, right? And again, since tariff is an indirect tax, it is also regressive in nature, and like I said, it would hit hard more on poor than the rich, and that results into an inequality of income in society. So this would actually be another bomb evaluation for your answer, right? Another evaluation that you can give for the third evaluation would be that you need to understand that a World Trade Organization also has certain aims and principles, because World Trade Organization encourages more of free trade, and it it wants less of protectionist measures, and it wants the trade to be kind of fair, it wants the trade to be consistent. And if you're kind of imposing these protectionist measures, you're actually breaking rules, because just to reduce your own personal country's current account deficits, if you're imposing if you're breaking such rules, it could lead to huge action by the World Trade Organization, or a heavy fine being imposed on you, right? Again, and the in that case, the World Trade Organization may allow your trading partner to retaliate back, and that would be a legal retaliation, right? A more stricter retaliation. The WTO would allow the country to do that, right? The fourth evaluation, guys, that you can make is that you need to understand that these protectionist measures, because these tariffs and these quotas, these can be inflationary. And why can they be inflationary, guys? They can be inflationary, and that results into a conflict between other macroeconomic objectives. Because although you're trying to make your balance of payment you're trying to reduce the deficit from your current account, or you can say that your balance of payment is in a disequilibrium position, you're trying to bring it back to equilibrium by reducing the current account deficit. But again, guys, that would result into a conflict between the other macroeconomic objectives. How would that happen? It's very simple. So let's see. What will happen is that, especially if you're importing, that would depend upon what nature of goods that you're importing. So if you're importing raw material and important commodities, in that situation, such as raw material and key commodities, what will happen? These are used by firms as raw materials in the in the production of goods and services, and this would increase the domestic cost of production, COP, cost of production. I'm just writing it in this video, but you guys won't write it in the exam. So domestic cost of production, you write it in full form. So domestic cost of production for businesses will rise, and especially for those businesses who are reliant on these imports. And especially, you need to understand that the PED for such imports would be less than one. It would be inelastic because they are key raw materials and commodities. And what will ultimately happen is that if the cost of production is rising, guys, again, let's listen to what I'll say because it's a chain of analysis that I will frame. So if the cost of production is rising, that increase in cost will be passed on to the consumer through a rise in prices, and that would result into a cost push inflation, right? And you know that cost push inflation culminates into stagflation, right? So, even if you're importing, it's not only about the raw materials that are kind of expensive. Let's say if you're importing food and all of that stuff, and that becomes expensive, so food is used by everyone, so it might result into food inflation. Definitely, even if you're importing finished goods into the country, and if they are being imported at a much higher price, it will increase the inflation throughout the economy because it has a rippling effect on other areas as well, right? So this is the fourth evaluation. Now there's another evaluation that you can make is, and I kind of love this evaluation, and that is that protectionism versus worsens, not versus, world allocation of resources. It versus world allocation of resources, that it results into an inefficient resource allocation. Because what's happening is that basically you need to understand that if I make the tariff diagram, demand and supply, and this is the world, if this is the quantity of Q1, Q3 is the quantity that was initially being imported, and this is the world price. This is the world price, and this is the price after tariff, that is PW plus tariff. So basically, this is the supply, and supply is the marginal cost for domestic producers. We know that. So now it reduces the amount of imports to, let's say, Q4 and Q2. So this is the amount of imports now. We know that, but that's not the point that I'm trying to make. You need to understand that look at this, guys. This is very important and very interesting as well. Domestic production increases by this area. We know that, right? Initially, this much was produced. Now, how much is produced? Now we know that basically domestic production increases by by this area, right? So this area is representing increase in domestic production. Now, guys, listen to me very carefully. You know that supply curve is representing the marginal cost. So the marginal cost for the international producers is this much. In order to produce this quantity, the marginal cost is this much for the international producers, while the marginal cost for domestic producers is this much, right? So the marginal cost for domestic producers is this much, which exceeds the marginal cost for the international producers. So, which means that all of these extra goods are being produced at a much higher marginal cost, because tariff is just giving the domestic producers an artificial advantage, and these extra goods that are being produced by so and so country could have been produced by the external world at a much lower marginal cost. So this area, guys, it represents the deadweight loss of world efficiency. Although this area was part of consumer surplus as well, but again this area is also representing the deadweight loss of world efficiency. So that is why we say that it results into a deadweight loss of world efficiency. So I would love calling it a deadweight loss of world efficiency, or it's an inefficiency loss, because production is being moved away from efficient producers to more of inefficient producers. This is a very good evaluation that you can make, especially if a question on international trade or tariff comes. You're gonna nail it if you just write these kind of points. So again, and so what is happening is that resources are being diverted to less efficient domestic producers instead of more efficient foreign producers, right? And again, what is going to happen is that this will distort the comparative advantage. This is a very important point, because if resources are allocated to more inefficient producers than the efficient producers, it will distort the comparative advantage that the efficient producers had, and it will result into a resource misallocation, resulting into allocative, I would call it allocative inefficiency, right? So these are the 5 evaluations that I have taught you regarding the protectionist measures that you will write in your answers, especially while solving a past paper question on expenditure, reducing and switching policies. Now there is another expenditure switching policy that you can make, and that is regarding the exchange rate. But guys, I would not want to do it in this video because this has already been a large video. So let me cover it in the next video. So just click the part 2 for expenditure reducing and dampening policies. I'll see you around in that video. Till then, take care.